Hi everybody, it's Precious Pioneer and welcome to Tea with P, the daily show where I talk about everything and everything related to baking and pastries. So we're kicking it off with episode 1. Why is baking so hard, and what are some key tips to ensure that we have a perfect, wonderful bake every single time? Many chefs find baking and pastries impossible in the culinary side of the world because it's a science and a chemistry. And though that is true, baking does require a lot of time and precision. I feel like it's very similar to cooking in many ways, that you need to pay attention to how certain things look, and then it's also based on all of the senses, like the way things feel, and when you touch it, like does it spring back, and looking out for different signals and signs of the cooking process. Just like ratatouille, I do believe that everybody can learn to bake, but just like with everything, baking does come with a learning curve and just a little bit of practice. Baking and pastries can be a little bit intimidating because a lot of recipes require a lot of time, and there's a lot of pressure to avoid making a single mistake, because there's nothing worse than like making a sourdough or something, and that takes 2 days, like when you start, or even a week-long process if you start your sourdough like starter in the week, and then you finally make the sourdough like the night before, you let it sit in the fridge to do the slow proof overnight, and then you go and bake it and then it fails. There is like nothing worse than dedicating a full week sometimes to like a pastry or a bread or something, and it just does not turn out the way that you want, and that can be a little bit discouraging. But I'm here to encourage you that with each failed bake, you will learn something every single time and you will get better, and I think that's kind of the beauty of it. I remember the very first time I ever made a cake, I didn't know that a cake doubled in size when you put it in the cake tin, and so I remember, I think it was like in middle school or maybe like a freshman in high school, I poured all of the cake batter in one like 9-inch cake tin, and instead of like splitting it in two and filling it halfway, and I just threw that in there without like a bottom tray or anything, and I came back to the kitchen to a fire alarm sounding off and a molten lava cake that I did not plan for. Needless to say, my mom was not very happy, and I think I was banned from the kitchen for a while, and I needed to be like supervised for a while. Like I needed permission to use the oven because, man, everything was burned. It was just impossible to clean. And so I understand that like sometimes these baking fails like are disappointing, but they make for good stories later, and they give you a lesson at the end of the day. Like I've never made that mistake again. Like I know now you need to like level out your cakes and all these different things. So I think that baking comes with a lot of trial and error, so be a little bit more forgiving with yourself if, you know, it doesn't poof up the way that you want, or falls flat, or some of your baked goods end up hard or crunchy or whatever it may be. This is what this show is dedicated for, by the way. So ask all of your baking questions, but just know that it will take a little bit of up and downs before you're like the master baker on the British baking competition. No, just kidding. So how do we make baking easier? I recommend starting off with simple recipes. Each recipe requires a different level of technique, and I think that starting off with batch doughs that you can just mix together and monitor just how certain ingredients react with each other is a great way to start off. And so those are things like sweet loaves, like banana breads, or any sort of those, like you like mix it, those cakes where you mix and you dump it in a loaf pan. Any sort of those recipes are really great. Cookies are great to start off, brownie mixtures, these sort of things, because I feel like sometimes when you start something new, you need like good like wins. Like, you know, if you fail after a while, then it's easy to just disregard something and be like, okay, I give up, I'm not good at this. But if you start off really simple and you're successful at it, you need to build up, when you develop a new skill, you need to develop like the steps to be able to be like, oh yeah, you know, the cookies turned out pretty good, let's try this. It's gaining your confidence. The beautiful thing about cooking and pastries is that once you master a technique or a skill or even a recipe, like first off you follow the recipe and like you nailed it, then you can add your own personal twist or your personal style to the recipe, and you can experiment more once you understand the foundation and how things work. And so I think that pastry is a lot more forgiving than people give it credit for. I just think that like people are trying to build houses without building the foundation, and then are surprised when it like falls over. But once you know how to master the perfect chocolate chip cookie, then you're probably like, you know what happens if I add peanut butter? Or my friend is vegan, what can I use instead of eggs and butter to still make this recipe work out? And so it's asking these questions that make you a better baker, that develop your skill sets, that develop the techniques. And so starting off really simple, you know, maybe don't start off with an opera cake that has 7 different recipes just to assemble, you know? So maybe start off something super simple and then gradually sub out different things, you know, ask some questions, add some things, take some things out. And then that's how you really like sharpen your skills and gain confidence in becoming a great baker. Okay, what do you need? What do you need to get started? I say that just like with cooking, a chef is only as good as their sharpest knife, which goes to say that your tools are really, really important and they make the job easier. But if you're baking at home, it is not everything. Like, you can definitely get away with scrapping things together with what you have. That's perfectly fine. But I want to let you know that when you sub out certain things or certain materials or ingredients based on what you have, you do sacrifice something with that as well. Like, there is a difference between hand mixing and using a certified mixer. There is a difference. In the States, we use measuring cups and spoons. There's a difference between using those and then eyeballing it. So just know that with the give and take, you also don't get the result exactly how you want it as well, you know? I know abroad they use a scale and they measure everything in grams. I personally like that style because with recipes here in the States, they're very, not biased, but they're very, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so sometimes recipes fail, not because on your end, but because sometimes it's like, oh, a mounting pile of this or a loose cup of brown sugar. And so sometimes those little discrepancies when you're first starting out, if you don't know what you're looking for, it can be very difficult to gauge whether the recipe is right or not. Like, as you gain experience and you notice your dough's a little loose, even though it's at a cup of water, you know, okay, well, like if I add a little bit of flour here just to like get the mixture a little bit thicker to the consistency you want, it'll be fine. Those skills will develop over time. And so sometimes like having the proper tools to make sure that it's best aligned with the recipe will just make your success a lot easier. It will go smoothly. Having a proper rolling pin is helpful. I know there's like hacks and dupes of like using a wine bottle and all these things. And like, yes, to some degree, if you're just cooking with friends or whatever, like that's perfectly fine. But if you're really trying to ensure that you have a really great baked product at the end of the day, some of these little tools help. I find that when you're first starting out with simple recipes, you really don't need a lot. You can get away with using just a bowl and a whisk and whisking together in a pan and just calling it a day. And then over time, as you add more recipes to your repertoire, you might need to pick up 1 or 2 items, and then over the years you'll have an inventory of a very beautiful pastry utensils kit. But do you need to go to Target and buy all of those items right now? Absolutely not. You can start off with the bare minimum and then slowly add to your collection. Let's jump into the essential tips that you need to know to just have a wonderful bake. I feel like there are 2 main parts to instantly elevate your current baking. There's an airplane. There are 2 main parts to instantly elevate your baking, and that will be number 1, to understand the ingredients that you're working with, and number 2, temperature control. Number 3 would be technique, but that is a skill you'll develop over time. Going into number 1, when you're first starting out, you're going to be working with ingredients such as flour, sugar, eggs, and some sort of leavening agent. And just understanding how these 4 things work when combined together could work wonders in your life. For example, when flour and water are added together, it hydrates the flour, but when you work it, it develops the gluten in flour, which is fantastic for bread, but horrible for pastries. Like, you don't want any gluten in your cakes. And so when you're over mixing and mixing for your cakes, you're developing the gluten, and that's why your cake is all like chewy and weird, you know? But on the other hand, if you want to make like scones or biscuits or whatever, there's a reason why you add your flour and your butter first and you like combine it in however form that you want. It's because like the fat covers the flour a little bit, so when you add the water, fat and water repel, so it hydrates the dough so slowly that there's like no gluten at all. And so when you put the pastry in the oven, all the little butter melts, creating all these little wonderful pockets that gives you the flaky and crunchiness that we all love and desire. So knowing how these ingredients react with each other, and looking out for the signs of how these sort of things develop over time, to see whether something is raw or not when you touch a cake and it springs back up. All these little details really can enhance your bake by not only paying attention, but touching, feeling, stretching will develop your skill sets. So like when you accidentally add too much, or there's not enough, you can kind of see the signs and be like, hey, this dough's a little too wet. We can add a little bit here, add a little bit of this, and then you know that it will still be great by the time you put it in the oven. Number 2, temperature control. When the recipe says the butter needs to be cold, it needs to be cold. When it says it needs to be room temperature, it needs to be room temperature. Butter is great. Room temperature butter is great for creaming things like cookies, because when you add the warm butter, or not really warm, but room temperature butter, and then you add the sugar, and then you cream it with a paddle, all the sugar in the butter creates these like air pockets and makes it like light and fluffy. It's also great for like buttercreams, how you like whip it like that, and then you control the temperature of it when you add, what is it called? The hot syrup, water and sugar, or water and sugar. What do you call that? Simple syrup. When you add the simple syrup to your buttercream or whatever, controlling the fire or controlling the temperature. A lot of chefs use the little fire gun, and you're like, and you like make sure that the temperature is regulated so it can like emulsify properly. Also, cold butter is great for pie pastries, puff pastries, and things like that, because like I said before, when you add the cold butter and then it goes in the oven, it creates the layers and flakiness that you want. But if it's too warm and your kitchen's too hot and it melts in the dough, the dough will become tougher. So make sure that you get the exact result that you want. Some other key tips. Number 3, read the recipe twice if you need to. Honestly, I think the standard should read it twice, even more, a couple more times if necessary. I feel like it helps prevent simple mistakes like substituting baking soda for baking powder, because those are two completely different things. Also, it helps you know the procedure of certain things. A lot of recipes will have you add your dry mixture gradually to your wet mixture, but sometimes it's in reverse. And then sometimes they'll have you alternate between the two. So reading your instructions first will help you to sort of go through the recipe easier, and then use the recipe as like a reference or a recall as you're actually working through the recipe. Sometimes there's like surprises in there that you didn't know that you needed to do, like maybe you needed to heat up something while you were in the process of making the recipe, but it's like too late at the end. So these sort of things are really important to monitor. This one's so simple, but just don't let it stick. Don't let it stick, unless it's like a sourdough that you're working on, but that's a whole nother thing. But when it comes to your cakes, make sure that you grease the pan properly. When you make your cookies, use parchment paper. When you're rolling out a pie dough, use as much flour as you need, flipping constantly before you think that you need to. All of these little details add up to the overall aesthetic of how your final result will turn out, because sometimes like things are a little bit lopsided or look a little funny, or your cookies are too brown at the bottom because of these things, these small little details that could have been avoided, because I think that the most beautiful pastries are all in the details. So if you get the small things right, they really start to add up, and you're able to present something really beautiful. Going into the last tip, let your baked goods cool properly before cutting into them. I know, trust me, I know pulling something absolutely delicious from the oven, the first thing you want to do is just try a little bit, because you've worked so hard to make sure that it turned out great. But just like cooking in a lot of ways, like with meat products and stuff like that, when you take baked goods out of the oven, oftentimes it's finishing its cooking process. And so when you cut into bread or a cake or something like that too early, it's raw on the inside because you didn't let it cool down properly. And things like desserts that have filling, like cheesecakes or pies, oftentimes need an extra amount of time to set while it's cooling. So like if you cut into it too early, it's like this soupy mess and you think that you failed, but really it just needed a proper time to cool and then refrigerate it. I think it's definitely worth the time to wait. Like, you've worked so hard, like why ruin it in the last final moments, you know? And I think that those are the main key tips to elevate your bake. Send me all of your questions. I'd love to continue this show just every day, just answering all of your baking questions, because yeah, I want all you guys to make delicious, beautiful things. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye.